This Sunday is the second Sunday of Advent as we lead up to Christmas. Each Advent Sunday there's a theme, and if you've noticed in our liturgy today, the theme for this week is peace. In our lesson, we read that wonderful prophecy from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah about a coming Messiah. He predicts that this all-powerful leader will arise, rescue Israel, create peace in the world, and calls him Prince of Peace. Now, Christians believe that this prophecy from Isaiah is about the Messiah, and it's predicting Jesus coming into the world. So we can ask ourselves then, what does it mean that Jesus is called the Prince of Peace? And as I thought about it, maybe you did too, if Jesus came into the world as the Prince of Peace, then why is there still conflict? Why haven't we experienced world peace? Why are there still wars? So to answer these questions, we need to recognize first that our expectations of what a Prince of Peace should look like could be wrong. And that is something that's true throughout history. The people of Jesus' time thought that Jesus would come as a Messiah, he'd be born and recognized by everyone at birth, he'd be raised up as a prince in training, and he'd ultimately raise up an army, overthrow the powers that be, and free his people from the struggles of oppression under Rome. He'd be so powerful that he'd bring world peace. So it's a bit ironic, but for them, the Prince of Peace meant a warlord, someone who would bring peace through vanquishing their opposition. Now, locked into that expectation of who Jesus would be, the birth of Jesus was largely missed by the world of his time. They had an idea, an expectation of what the Messiah would be like, and Jesus wasn't that Messiah. So everyone is so sure about how it would happen that they missed it. Jesus did not come into the world as expected. He was born in the lowliest of locations. In a very short time in his life, he's forced with his parents to escape to Egypt to avoid being killed by the powers that be. The only people that come to his birth, as we remember, are these very lowly shepherds called by an angel in the fields, and wise scholars from a distant land. Two groups that were not locked in with clear expectations of how the Messiah would come. They were both open to what would unfold. Today, we also project into our lives, our plans, and our visions of how we are sure things must unfold. Most of the stress in our life is the frustration with a world that does not bow to our expectations. Things don't go the way we want them to go. We are surprised by events, and when we're surprised, it makes us feel out of control and anxious. These expectations forced onto the world can make us depressed. We don't have peace because the world's not working out the way we expect it to. Jesus, his life wasn't what the world expected in a Messiah. During his adult ministry, his radical message of love and forgiveness, of self-awareness, did not line up with what the elite religious establishment expected of their Prince of Peace. In fact, the religious leaders of his time actually called him the Prince of Demons for his healing work. And this wasn't just true of the religious establishment. Some of those who followed him admired him, but they also grew disappointed that he did not meet their expectations. Zealots were a faction of the Jewish people who had their own expectations too. They imagined that a Messiah, and in this case Jesus, would be a leader of a violent revolutionary movement to repel Rome and free their people. Some scholars believe that Judas decided to betray Jesus because he was a member of that group, and he grew disappointed that Jesus would not lead the revolt, but instead He taught his followers to love their enemies. Because they had such certain expectations, they all missed Jesus, the Prince of Peace. And we risk that today. We find ourselves confused by a title, Prince of Peace. It's not how we expect things in the world. We expect there to be actual peace. But in his own life, Jesus would be tortured and killed along with his disciples. Those zealots that I talked about, well, eventually they would make their move against Rome, which would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem only a few decades after Jesus' death. The history of wars around the world would continue, and just this last week, we look around us and we see events in South Korea, we see Ukraine and Russia, we see Iran, we see Syria, we see constant conflict in the world. So what does believing in a Prince of Peace offer us in times of turmoil and war? Well, we can learn the lesson from the past, from those that went before us, that we cannot see the biggest picture. We see just a piece of it. We might be convinced we know the geopolitical answer to all the world's problems. And it's very likely that we're wrong. We see a part of it. We might be so sure that we have the answers that if God would just do as we insisted, things would work out in the world. And what we do is we miss the way that God is really working in our lives, in the world. We can learn from Jesus that peace that he is talking about is not of this world. He tells his disciples before his death, "My peace I give you, not the peace of this world." The peace of Jesus is not impacted by the daily headlines of this world. It's an internal calm in the midst of the storm. It's the peace of knowing God loves us regardless of world circumstances, and that God can work through us. Believing in a Prince of Peace reminds us that we need to place our trust in God, not just lip service, but truly trusting in God, not ourselves. That's a hard thing for us to hear in a world where we're told that we are in control and we are responsible, but we must trust God. We need to realize that we can do all the right things in our life. We can work with the Holy Spirit to love more, to judge less, to forgive more. If we're doing that, if we're really looking at our shadow side, the things in our life we're not particularly happy with, and we're trying to address it, then the angels can work in our life and connect us to the flow of divine providence. Our tendency to push our agenda and our expectations will not work. What we need to do is trust, really trust, that God is working in our life in every detail of every day for good. This knowledge that we are safe in God's hands gives us peace. Like the people of Jesus' day who completely missed his coming, we too must pay attention. Like the shepherds, we have to wake up spiritually. And that requires us to constantly surrender our egos to the divine path. When we end our battling for doing things our way, we can relax in that peace that passes all understanding and be in the flow of God working through us. Experiencing the peace of the Lord becomes even more important in our chaotic world. Our world needs healers. Our world needs peacemakers. And we can only be that if we are at peace ourselves. To heal the world, we need to heal ourselves. To have peace in the world, we need to have peace in our souls. Like so much in all spiritual teaching, it always comes back to the changes we need to make in our lives. Yes, we want to condemn those guys over there for making such a mess of things. If only we were in charge. But we are required to always look first at the plank in our own eye and address the things in our own life that do not align with peace. We need to stop forcing our plan and live more humbly, open to the plan that unfolds that God has created in our life. We can release the stress and frustration when the world does not meet our expectations, trusting that we have a role to play if we are open and awake. We can embrace surprise, realizing we're not in control. By truly trusting that God is working in our world and through our lives, we can experience the peace that passes all understanding. And as Jesus told us, peace I leave you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Amen. Any questions or comments or thoughts on the topic of the Prince of Peace?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Sure.
At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says something to the effect, those who hear these words of mine and act on them will be like one who built his house on a rock. And the winds came and the rivers rose and the floods came and the house did not fall. So it seems to me that he's talking specifically about this issue of having peace despite the disarray around you. And provides also a specific way to approach that in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's one thing I would add to what you said, but it's a little bit more specific than what you said. A second place where he more or less says the same thing is he speaks specifically about anxiety. I think that was also in the Sermon on the Mount too. I'm not sure about that, but I think it was. And is don't be anxious, seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all else will be added unto you. So those two things, I think, sort of add to what you said.
Those are wonderful
Thank you.
additions. Yeah, wonderful additions. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Rich. Great sermon.
Thank you.
One question is, how can we use kind of the Prince of Peace teachings to think about the fact that there is so much evil ongoing? So like how to have peace within it, but then also like, how can we help make sense of just the fact that this is happening? I know you said that we don't, like, it's like you accept you don't understand, but then what else can you do besides that?
So is your question how to come to terms with evil in the world, or is your
Pretty
question?
much, yeah. Pretty
Yeah,
much.
question of evil. One of our most popular questions at church, and it's a tough one. Yeah, there is one reason I stress that, like Jesus' life, he's born in a terrible situation. He's threatened with his life, and then of course he's killed. So the promise that Jesus says is not that there's not going to be evil in the world. As long as humanity has the choice between good and evil, there will be bad things happening. So that's a reality, and that's not that idea of that we're going to live in a perfect world with no evil things and then therefore no choice to do evil. That's not an option. There will be always a choice, and as long as people choose, there will be people choosing evil. So that's the reality of the world that we're in. The question is, how do we navigate that? And in the way we navigate that is that it's through those struggles. Like peace comes through the struggles. Spiritual growth happens through the struggles. It happens through the engagement with those forces. And we are first of all, part of that evil in the world is the things that we've cultivated, that we have to. So we start with ourselves, but then if we can be if we're healing ourselves and we're out to heal the world, I think that's what your question then is, like, what do we do with it? Then the world needs healers, and it needs peacemakers. It needs people who will step up. And that really is going to require great spiritual discipline to enter into the fray that is the world. And it will be different for all of us, but it's desperately needed. And so it would be different for each person. But we're not promised that the world will be without conflict. We're promised pretty much the world will have conflict. The question is how we can navigate it, and then what role we can play to, as we say in the Lord's Prayer. We say, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." So ultimately, our goal is to play our role here too. That we want to play a role to make it a better place. Does that address the question?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think that maybe just one sermon on the topic of evil would be fun, because it does come up a lot, and it is very puzzling. It's one of the biggest puzzles. Why is, despite all that, are these puzzles? In the only other thing I'd say is in the life of Jesus, we look at all the negative, right? The lowly birth, the escape, the ridicule, the torture, and the execution. And we all look at that and say, wow, what a disaster of a story. But we don't. We look at it and say, wow, the most transformative person in the history of the world, even if you don't believe him. Wow. So it is also how God works in those situations and works through the Jesus being God coming into human form is a lesson for us, what we can do. And in retrospect, it turns out to be the most dramatic and powerful moment in the history of the world. But if you were in that moment, like the disciples, you might be hiding. So I think perspective on it is important as well.
You mentioned Judas and his role in Jesus being betrayed and arrested and so forth. And my thought with regard to Judas was that he was trying to force Jesus to become that Messiah, the strong, powerful person that was going to call for revolution now, and all these forces would be overthrown. And he thought if Jesus were arrested, that he would have no choice in the matter. I regard it as one of the ultimate manipulations that was attempted. But I've always kind of viewed Jesus standing before his accusers and being taken to the cross, someone who was passively allowing God's plan to be taken and fulfilled. And but tonight, as you speak about the Prince of Peace, it's not pacifism, it's the peaceful king who responds to all these circumstances in the final moments of his life here on earth by remaining peaceful and accepting the cruel, terrible things that happened to him, including his death, as an example of how to live peacefully. I had never thought in those terms before.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you for that observation. Jesus does flip the narrative of what power is and what weakness is perceived in that moment. We rarely see this acted out, but I would say if you read the history of the the Black civil rights movement in the United States, and Martin Luther King Jr. and the teachings of that group, they really said, we are not going to respond. And there's a new book out about Congressman Lewis, who was a young protege. And he says at one point, someone came to sucker punch, or someone did sucker punch Reverend King in the lobby of a hotel they were coming into, a recently desegregated hotel. And that Congressman, grabbed him and pulled him away. And he writes in his memoir that he regrets that he broke with the practice of nonviolent response. And I was kind of blown away by that, because I would at least have done that. And the point was, that's not the path. And so again, we look at that movement as one of the most, I would say, the most successful movements in the last 100 years. And it's premised on the power of, with Jesus, of not responding. So it does shake things up. It does flip what was powerful and what isn't powerful, and what is weak, what looks weak, and who looks strong. It doesn't pan out in the the more eternal aspects of it. So thanks for raising that. Yeah, it's a very powerful lesson in the life of Christ. And thanks for reading as well. You did a beautiful job reading. I appreciate that. Roxanne?
I think, the idea of peace on the night before Jesus was crucified, I, if I remember correctly, he was in the garden and he was full of anxiety and every possible human emotion. He was, my God, you know, why you're doing this to me. Um, so there was a lot of questioning, a lot of anxiety taking place within the garden, if I remember correctly. And so at what point does Jesus find his peace?
Definitely, he is incredibly anxious. There's one gospel story that describes blood coming out of his head out of just sheer stress.
Mm-hmm.
He's about to be humiliated, tortured, extremely painful execution for teaching love and kindness. So he knows that's coming. So there's definitely that. Not to get too theological, but it's sort of a theological question, so I'll take it on. It's a question of what we would call like Christology, who is Jesus. And so in our tradition, different from others maybe, but there is a battle going on in Jesus' own life with his human aspects and his divine aspects. And we're witnessing at this moment, this battle is culminating, and that it culminates ultimately on the cross. And that the ultimate temptation for Jesus was to stop it, to get off the cross, to stand up for himself in front of, do some miracles in prison, as maybe Judas was hoping. But that overcoming of the human and is what is referred to as the glorification that takes place on the cross, and then the resurrection. And so that there's a spiritual battle going on, even with Jesus, going back to being tempted at the beginning of his ministry. And there's a provocative movie called The Last Temptation of Christ. It's also,
Mm-hmm.
it was quite controversial when it came out. I remember I saw it many years ago, gosh, maybe 30 years ago when it came out, and then you had police dogs go through the movie theater because there were bomb threats. And the movie imagines what would happen if Jesus did get off the cross. It's the story of him getting off the cross and what his life would have been like. And he gets married, and that pissed people off, that they portrayed Jesus as getting married and having a wife and so forth. But the point was, it's a very provocative theological question. That is the temptation. That is the power of the cross and Jesus overcoming it. And therefore, on our behalf, and as a model to us. I hope that wasn't too theological, but
No, it's just I'm still struggling with, the lack of peace that Jesus had in the garden. Because it's kind of like, because Jesus is the Prince of Peace, but at the same time, he was not experiencing the peace in the garden. Am I making myself understandable?
yeah,
There's a paradox there.
there is a paradox, and there's really no peace without struggle. I mean, there is no, we know peace like in the storm because the storm stops. We know peace because we have moments when where things are very intense and stressful, and even points where we're confronting evil, and we're anxious, which is human, and we're fearful, which is human, and then but we're seeking that peace that does pass all understanding. It certainly seems, if you want to use Jesus as an example, the next day he's has an ability to defend himself in a court situation, and he refuses to do it. So there's a certain peace. And then also on the cross itself, he's stressed out. God, why have you forgotten me? But he also prays for those and says they don't know what they're doing. So it is, there is that the point of Jesus is that tension, that it's there, and that the peace is in the midst of that. And it can be more intense or less intense at different times. But particularly if any of us were being executed, we would have huge anxiety and stress. It's maybe our biggest fear. But I don't know about you, but my biggest fear is not death. My biggest fear would be torture. When I read stories of people being like kidnapped or hostages or tortured, oh my gosh, my mind does not want to go there. That's just so horrible. So that it would be. So that's that. I hope that sheds a little light on a very provocative question. Jose, you have your hand, or it could be Katie.
It's both, but I guess the way that I was thinking of it was that, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, I mean, the whole idea is that God is trying to manifest himself by becoming mortal to send his son. And it's not contradictory, therefore, to have an idea that even though he has his theology and he believes his place, he's still human and is naturally going to be afraid and is terrified at the prospect of being executed. And he eventually comes obviously around to it, but the idea that he's going to have moments of doubt in the garden isn't really all that contradictory. By the time you get to John, it's a much higher Christology, and he was in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and you have a much higher idea that he always existed, and you also don't have things like in Matthew the my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a much more Zen Buddhist Jesus, if you will. That's why I think that he seems more peaceful by the time you get to John, because it's a slightly different interpretation of what he even thought his own role was, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. Yeah, the different gospels do have a little different emphasis, as you pointed out. But I think that for me, the key point is that the life of Christ is helpful to us because he went through the things we go through and experienced it in human form. So if God just came as God and never had to experience anything like we do, it would not be it's not as relatable. So the fact that we're going to have times where we're going to be afraid, stressed out, fearful, it's all very natural. It probably happens a couple times every day, right? That's what's being human. It's how we deal with it. And that if we can, even in the midst of stress and doubt and fear, there is a peace that passes all understanding. And I will just say in my own life, I've certainly experienced that, where I can be stressed out and still know that I'm loved by God and I'm connected to God, and that has carried me through very stressful, horrible situations. So that's seems to be that tension in the life of Jesus is the tension that we'll experience in our own lives. But excellent point, Jose. Thank you. I love everybody chiming in on these things. Matthias or Ellie?
Hi, this is Matthias. Hi. So my question was about kind of like confrontation or like conflict in your daily life, and like instances where you feel like you're being, you're in a conflict, or you don't want to get like, stepped all over or something like that. I feel like I often struggle with that feeling of wanting to, like be strong and like kind of stand up for yourself. And how do you think that relates to finding internal peace or being like a peaceful person? Do you think that like finding internal peace is not in contradiction with like sometimes being confrontational? Or do you think that if you have that internal peace, that reduces your tendency to be like confrontational in the world? and whether that's like a bad feeling or a feeling that isn't particularly like in line with Christianity or not.
It's a good question. I think that if so all that Jesus did in his teachings was this radical idea of love your enemy, change your own life. But these were really radical, pray for your enemy, really radical ideas. And for that, he was confronted, and he was, confronted. So I don't think we can avoid confrontation in our life. If in Jesus' life, he's just teaching good things and doing good things, he's attacked for healing people. Okay, so if Jesus is experiencing confrontation, I think confrontation and conflict is a part of life. How we choose to respond in each situation based on the teachings of Jesus, I think that we should try to love even our enemies. That does not mean submitting to abuse, and it doesn't mean submitting to unhealthy situations. So a bad example of this would be ministers who say to women who come to them, "My husband's beating me," and the pastor says, "Well, submit yourself to your husband." That to me is ridiculous. You don't submit yourself to evil. And Jesus also at one point says to the disciples, something that I've often kept in mind. Jesus says a lot of things, but he also says, "Be wise as serpent and gentle as doves." And he says, when you go to a town and they reject you, he says, pick up take your sandals up and clap them together and let the sand be knocked off of them. And there are situations in our life where we just need to get away from that situation, and we have to have healthy boundaries. And if you're around, say, like a narcissistic person or an abusive person or a person who's under substance abuse and is these, you need to get away. You do not need to submit. And if people are treating you with disrespect, but for the most part, we can really seek in confrontation, because of God working through us. We can ask God, what am I to learn from this person? What teaching? What am I learning about myself? Is there something I could learn about myself? Doesn't mean the person's right, but it's a way of taking what looks to be the quote enemy and saying, maybe this is a perspective I don't understand, or can I be more compassionate? And that power to be more compassionate in those situations, I would say, is God working through us. It's not natural. And I think that is the call of a Christian. But I think, like in your daily life, people are abusing you or you can. I would even go as far as sometimes you're around very negative energy with certain people, and I think it's very healthy to move away if you can. It's just not healthy to submit yourself to it, and you might succumb to it. So I think we will face confrontation in life. And particularly people who seek to do good will be confronted. And I think we're always asked to see if we could love more and not turn toward contempt. And that's the challenge. And we can do that with God's help. But it doesn't mean submitting ourselves in any way to negative behavior. Does that answer your question, Matthias?
Yes, thank you.
Katerina?
Thank you, Rich. So going off the theme of this sermon, who are the peacemakers that Jesus refers to in the Sermon on the Mountain? And what does it take to go from being at peace to being a peacemaker? Is it sort of like a higher calling, like being a disciple or a mediator, or it's something that each and every one of us can do?
Well, so in the Sermon on the Mount, he does have a phrase where he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He's sort of calling out a particular type of person, that seems to be almost unusual. Like that is the path, and they're blessed. I do think it's a higher evolution of a spiritual person that can really have no hatred and no contempt, and can be a bridge builder and seek to build peace. People like that, peacemakers generally don't have their own agenda anymore. They've evolved to, when you meet people like that, their only agenda is to see if they can bring together the group or resolve the issue. It's not about them. And I think that increasingly I'm seeing in the world right now that leadership is more about facilitation of differences than it is really telling people what to do, like we used to think of it, like, command and control. And I believe that's the role of the peacemakers that Jesus is talking about. So the Sermon on the Mount is the, if you will, it's the manifesto of Jesus. He's saying, here's all the things that, these are the blessed people. And it will be a struggle our whole life to live up to any of those. But I will just say for this church community, I believe we've been, if you look at a lot of the talents in our community and our location, I think we're being called at a time of crisis to be peacemakers in a culture where, frankly, Christianity doesn't have a really good image right now, playing that role. And so we could, I think, as a community, play a better role, not just as individuals, but as a community of being peacemakers. I think it's what's most needed in the world right now, and it's increasingly hard to do because people are really much more drilling down into their own sides and in us them thinking and believing that they're right and the other side is not just wrong but evil. So that's increasingly, we've talked about it many times in this community, but I believe that's the calling of our time is there anybody that could love people in that on both sides of that equation and not be so wrapped up in being right, but seek to hear people and to love people who have differences. So I think it's a good question. I think that's what we're called to do. And as I was saying, we can't really heal until we've healed ourselves. And that includes our shadow side, the dark side that we all have. And we can't really be peacemakers if we're anxious and stressed out and and engaged in constantly engaged in battle with people. We can't really be peacemakers. So the work will start with us first. And that's how God would work. Back to Ellie's question earlier, I think that's how God works in the world, is through individuals and communities. And I believe this community is called for that purpose. And I think we're going to come into increasingly more challenging times of this lack of peace, both globally in the terms of wars and conflicts, but in our own country. And so we're going to have to really be more introspective ourselves, how we can be ready for that and play our role. Does that make sense, Katerina?
Does, and it reminds me of a phrase my coach once told me: the best gift you can give to this world is to put yourself together. So when I'm at stress, no matter how busy I am, I take a few minutes to just put myself at a state of peace and go into the next situation. But I think it's very relevant to what we're going through as a community. Thank you.
It's hard work. It's constantly looking at your edges and being a little less selfish and a little bit more, loving and compassionate. It's hard work. It's a life. It'll be our whole life mission. I see Roxanne has her hand up. I want to see if anybody else has a question before we come back to round two.
Jimmy had a few comments in the chat, if I may highlight them.
Yeah. Could you?
Wishing peace and blessings to each of us, and we did not know that he came to save our souls, this Prince of Peace, says Jimmy.
Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, we missed it. Jimmy always has a sense of peace, God in him, when I work with him at the church, so he's a good example. And we've been through a tumultuous period right now recently in the church life, and he's been just really a rock. Roxanne?
Well, one of the things that I love about Jesus is I see him as having, at times, moral outrage. And he expressed that, when he went into the temple and he was flipping the tables. So I just see him not as kind of a milquetoast peacemaker, but I see him as having extraordinary strength, and he was extraordinarily brave. as well. And he himself, there were many times that he was confrontational. Was he not? Like with the Pharisees and he stood his ground.
Yeah, he stood his ground. It's interesting. There's a whole the whole life of Jesus. I will just in the temple and out being angry and frustrated and turning over the tables and so forth. There's a whole theology that comes out of that actually. There's a book called God Acted Out and God Acted Up, and a lot of liberation theology draws on that story. But I would just caution that a lot of times it's only a few steps away from justifying violence in the name of Christianity. And so I'm cautious around it. It's Jesus definitely did it. He certainly was angry and he was frustrated, and we don't know that he didn't do violence against anyone. And so that definitely happened. I think the larger part of his message, though, is to check ourselves when we have contempt for others. And I'll just say in my own life, for example, on a regular basis, I catch myself judging people. And I'm talking about like judging people at the supermarket. Like people like nobody I know, but there's a thought that goes through my mind about people that I see casually. And I'm saying that's just a small example of that's something to work on. That is not a healthy thing, that constantly. And so, that definitely did happen. But I think the greater message is to reflect on ourselves and change ourselves and not.
I think of myself as, well, as far as like the judging thing, it's remember we had some communication about swearing, and I think very, very differently about swearing now than before I went to seminary. I see it as a means of communication, and but that's another story to get into. And I've really learned not to judge people when they use profanity. But I guess, it's like what Jose was saying, I think that as peacemakers, there needs to be tremendous strength there. Not that you're going to be flipping tables and things of that nature, but obviously, if you're in a situation where you have to be making peace, then you're dealing with some very, very strong personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that type of strength, you need to meet that strength,
Yes.
those strong personalities.
Yes. And Katerina, you're putting something in the chat.
I was just saying that there has to be strength, but also boundaries. And Jesus was very clear about his and reacted when those boundaries were crossed.
Thank you for that. And thank you for a great discussion. We covered everything from evil to Christology to violence to, I think, the whole spectrum of theological thought, which is wonderful. I love this group and I love the questions and I love the feedback other people give everybody. And it's a challenge, this Prince of Peace. I guess my final warning is be careful of your expectations of how you want things to go, and trust more in God that you're in the path of providence if you seek to be in that path, and things will work out.